I need you to know that on Thanksgiving night, my parents literally disowned me in front of my entire extended family, called me a disgrace to our bloodline, and told me I was no longer their son. And just when I thought my life was completely over, my grandmother, who everyone believed had been dead for 3 years, walked through the front door of our family home like she'd just returned from a vacation. Except she wasn't dead at all. She'd been living under a new identity as a billionaire tech investor. And the reason she came back was to punish every single person in my family who had made my life a living hell. I'm still processing what happened, and I need you to tell me if you think I was wrong for letting her do what she did to them, because part of me feels vindicated. But another part of me wonders if I should have stopped her before things went as far as they did. Let me take you back to the beginning so you can understand how we got here. My name is Derek. I'm 26 years old, and I grew up in what most people would consider a wealthy family in Connecticut. My father runs a successful commercial real estate company that his father started, and my mother comes from old money, the kind of family that has portraits of ancestors from the 1700s hanging in their dining room. I have an older brother named Chase who's 31, and he's always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one who took over a division of my father's company right out of business school and has been climbing the ladder ever since. Then there's me, and I've always been the disappointment, the black sheep, the one who didn't fit into their perfect mold of what a son should be. Growing up, I was more interested in art and music than I was in business and finance. I wanted to study graphic design and maybe work in advertising or start my own creative agency, but my parents made it very clear from the time I was in high school that this was unacceptable. My father would say things like, "Art is a hobby, not a career," and my mother would tell me I was being selfish for not wanting to contribute to the family legacy. They pushed me to go to business school, and I did. I went to a decent university and got my degree in business administration, but my heart was never in it. After I graduated, my father expected me to join the company just like Chase had, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I told him I wanted to pursue my own path, and that's when things really started to fall apart. My father was furious. He told me I was throwing away every opportunity he'd worked to give me, and my mother said I was breaking her heart. Chase, of course, took their side and made it clear that he thought I was being an ungrateful brat. The tension in our family became unbearable, but I stood my ground. I moved out of my parents' house, got a small apartment in the city, and started working as a freelance graphic designer. It was tough at first. I was barely making enough to cover rent and food, but I was happy because I was finally doing something I loved. My parents, however, saw this as a complete failure. They stopped inviting me to family dinners. They'd make snide comments whenever I did see them, and they made it clear that they were ashamed of me. The only person in my family who ever supported me was my grandmother on my mother's side, Helen. She was this incredible woman, smart, independent, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. She'd made her own money back in the day through some savvy investments, and she'd always encouraged me to follow my dreams. She'd tell me, "Derek, don't let them bully you into living a life that isn't yours. You only get one shot at this. Make it count." She was my rock, and when she passed away 3 years ago, I was devastated. She'd had a heart attack, or at least that's what we were told, and she was buried in the family plot after a small funeral. After she died, I felt more alone than ever because she was the only one who understood me. Fast forward to this year, and I have to admit that my life had started to turn around. My freelance work had picked up. I'd landed a few major clients, and I was actually making decent money. I'd even started seeing someone, a wonderful guy named Marco who worked as a teacher, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. But here's the thing. I hadn't told my family about Marco because I knew how they'd react. See, I'm gay, and while I'd never explicitly hidden it, I'd also never formally come out to my parents because I knew they'd lose their minds. My grandmother had known. She was the only one I'd ever told, and she'd been completely supportive, but I'd kept it from everyone else to avoid the inevitable drama. This Thanksgiving, my mother insisted that I come to the family dinner. She'd been trying to mend fences, or so she said, and she told me it would mean a lot to her if I was there. I was hesitant, but I agreed because part of me still wanted their approval, as much as I hated to admit it. Marco offered to come with me for moral support, but I told him it was probably better if he didn't because I wasn't ready for that confrontation. So I showed up at my parents' house on Thanksgiving, and it was the usual crowd. My parents, Chase and his wife Stephanie, a few aunts and uncles, and some cousins I barely knew. Dinner started out fine, polite conversation, talk about the business, the usual stuff. But then my mother asked me how my little design thing was going, and I could hear the condescension in her voice. I told her it was going well, that I'd actually been very successful, and she gave me this tight smile and said, "Well, that's nice, dear, but when are you going to settle down and think about your future?" I knew what she meant by that. She meant when was I going to give up on my dreams and fall in line. I tried to brush it off, and my father chimed in and said, "You know, Derek, it's not too late to join the company. Chase could use someone he trusts in the acquisitions department." I felt my blood pressure rising, but I kept my cool. I said, "Dad, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy with what I'm doing. I've built something I'm proud of." That's when Chase decided to get involved. He laughed and said, "Come on, Derek. You can't live like a struggling artist forever. What happens when you want to buy a house or start a family? You think your little design projects are going to cut it?" I snapped back. "I'm doing just fine, Chase. Not everyone needs to follow the exact same path you did." The table went quiet, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My mother, always the peacemaker in the worst possible way, tried to diffuse the situation by saying, "Derek, sweetheart, we're just worried about you. We want to see you settled and happy. Don't you want to get married someday, have children, give us grandchildren?" And that's when it happened. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was years of pent-up frustration. Maybe it was the wine. But I looked at her and said, "Actually, Mom, I am seeing someone. His name is Marco, and he makes me happier than anyone I've ever met." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went pale, my father's jaw clenched, and Chase actually dropped his fork. My aunt gasped, and I heard one of my cousins whisper something to another. My father was the first to speak, and his voice was cold and hard. He said, "What did you just say?" I repeated myself louder this time, because I wasn't going to back down. I said, "I'm gay, Dad. I've been seeing a man named Marco for 6 months, and I'm happy." My mother started crying, actual tears streaming down her face, and she said, "How could you do this to us? How could you bring this shame on our family?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I said, "Shame? Being who I am is shameful to you?" My father stood up from the table, his face red with anger, and he pointed at me and said, "You are no son of mine. I will not have this perversion under my roof or associated with my name." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I looked at Chase, hoping for some kind of support, but he just shook his head and said, "Derek, you've really done it this time. You've embarrassed all of us." My mother, still crying, said, "I can't even look at you. You're not the son I raised." I stood up, my hands shaking, and I said, "You never raised me to be myself. You raised me to be whatever you wanted me to be, and I'm done with that." My father walked over to me, and I thought for a second he might actually hit me, but instead he said, "Get out. You are no longer part of this family. You're disowned, effective immediately. Don't bother coming back." I looked around the table, hoping someone, anyone, would stand up for me, but they all just stared at their plates. Even my cousins, who I'd grown up with, said nothing. I grabbed my coat and walked out, and as I left, I heard my mother sobbing and my father saying, "He's made his choice." I drove back to my apartment in a complete daze. I felt like my entire world had collapsed. I called Marco, and he came over immediately and held me while I cried. He kept telling me that I'd done the right thing, that I deserved to live my truth, but all I could think about was how alone I felt. My family had abandoned me. The people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had thrown me away like I was nothing. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely eating, barely sleeping, just replaying that horrible dinner over and over in my mind. Then, 4 days after Thanksgiving, something happened that I still can't fully wrap my head around. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone and debating whether to block my family's numbers, when there was a knock at my door. I opened it, and standing there was a woman I didn't recognize at first. She was probably in her early 70s, well-dressed, with sharp eyes and a slight smile, and she said, "Hello, Derek. I think we need to talk." I was confused, and I asked her who she was, and that's when she said, "It's me, sweetheart. It's Grandma Helen." I literally stumbled backward. I thought I was hallucinating or that this was some kind of sick joke. I said, "That's not possible. You're dead. We buried you 3 years ago." She stepped into my apartment and closed the door behind her, and she said, "No, Derek, you buried a Jane Doe in a casket. I'm very much alive, and I've been watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to come back." I couldn't process what I was hearing. I demanded to know what she was talking about, and she sat me down and told me the most incredible story I've ever heard. 3 years ago, my grandmother had discovered something that made her realize she needed to disappear. She'd found out that my mother and my uncle, her own children, had been planning to have her declared mentally incompetent so they could take control of her estate. I'd been working with a shady lawyer to manipulate her finances, and they were just waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. My grandmother, who was sharper than anyone gave her credit for, figured out what they were doing and decided to turn the tables. She faked her own death with the help of a trusted friend who worked in the medical examiner's office, arranged for a body to be buried in her place, and then she disappeared. She'd taken her money, reinvested it under a new identity, and over the past 3 years, she'd built a tech investment portfolio worth over $2 billion. I was stunned. I asked her why she'd never reached out to me, and she said, "Because I needed to see who you really were, Derek. I needed to see if you'd stand up for yourself, or if you'd cave to their pressure. When you walked away from the family business and pursued your passion, I knew you were the only one worth saving." She told me she'd been keeping tabs on me the whole time, that she knew about Marco, about my success as a designer, about everything. And she said that when she heard about what happened on Thanksgiving, she knew it was time to come back. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. My grandmother, who I thought was dead, was back, and she had a plan to make my family pay for everything they'd done to both of us. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have let her go through with it, or would you have tried to forgive your family and move on? Because I'm still not sure if I made the right call. I listened as my grandmother laid out her plan. She was going to reveal herself to the family, but not before she systematically dismantled everything they held dear. She'd already been working behind the scenes, buying up shares in my father's company through shell corporations, and she now owned a controlling interest. She'd also been in contact with the IRS and had provided them with evidence of some questionable tax practices my father and Chase had been involved in. Nothing illegal enough to send them to prison, but enough to trigger a massive audit and some hefty fines. And she'd set up a trust fund in my name, worth $50 million, that would be released to me as soon as I agreed to let her proceed. I was torn. Part of me wanted revenge, wanted them to feel even a fraction of the pain they'd caused me, but part of me wondered if this was going too far. I asked my grandmother, why now? Why not just stay hidden and live your life? She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Because they don't deserve to win, Derek. They don't deserve to keep hurting people and getting away with it. Your mother and your uncle tried to rob me, and your father and brother tried to break you. Someone has to hold them accountable." I thought about Marco, about the life I was building, and I realized that I didn't owe my family anything. They'd made their choice when they disowned me, so I told my grandmother to do whatever she thought was right. The next day, my grandmother called a family meeting at my parents' house. She told them it was a lawyer representing her estate with important information about her will, and of course they all showed up because they were greedy and hoping for an inheritance. I went with her, even though she told me I didn't have to, because I needed to see their faces. When we walked in, my mother screamed. She literally screamed and fainted, and my uncle caught her. My father went white as a sheet, and Chase just stood there with his mouth open. My grandmother smiled and said, "Hello, everyone. I'm back from the dead, and we have a lot to discuss." She didn't waste any time. She told them she knew about the plan to have her declared incompetent, about the financial manipulation, about everything. She told my father that she now owned his company and that she was removing him and Chase from their positions effective immediately. She told my mother that she was cutting her off completely, that she wouldn't see another dime of her money, and that she was ashamed to call her a daughter. And then she turned to all of them and said, "The only person in this family who has any integrity is Derek, and you threw him away. So I'm giving him everything, and you can all live with the consequences of your greed and your hatred." My mother begged for forgiveness. My uncle tried to argue. My father threatened legal action, but my grandmother had covered every base. She had lawyers, she had documentation. She had everything she needed to make it stick. Chase, for his part, looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You did this. You turned her against us." I looked him in the eye and said, "No, Chase. You did this to yourselves. I just stopped letting you get away with it." The aftermath was brutal. My father and Chase lost their positions in the company, and my grandmother installed a new management team. The IRS audit resulted in fines that drained a significant portion of their savings. My mother had a breakdown and had to be hospitalized for a few days, and my uncle tried to sue my grandmother but lost spectacularly. Within 6 months, the family I'd grown up in was completely fractured. Some of my cousins reached out to me to apologize and try to rebuild a relationship, and I appreciated that, but I kept them at arm's length because I didn't know who to trust anymore. As for me, my life changed overnight. The trust fund my grandmother set up for me gave me financial security I'd never dreamed of. I expanded my design business, hired a small team, and started taking on bigger projects. Marco and I moved in together, and my grandmother, who insisted I call her Helen now instead of Grandma, became a regular part of our lives. She adored Marco and treated him like the grandson-in-law she'd always wanted. We had dinners together, we traveled, and she gave me advice on everything from business to relationships. It was like getting a second chance at having a family, one that actually loved and accepted me for who I was. My parents made a few attempts to reach out over the following year. My mother sent letters apologizing and begging for reconciliation. And my father called once to say he'd been too harsh and wanted to talk. But I didn't respond. I'd spent too many years trying to earn their love, and I wasn't going to fall back into that trap. Helen told me I didn't owe them anything, and she was right. They'd had their chance to be a family, and they'd chosen their pride and their prejudice over their own son. Now, 2 years later, I'm in a place I never thought I'd be. I'm successful, I'm in love, and I'm surrounded by people who actually care about me. Helen is still going strong, still investing, still proving that she's one of the sharpest minds in the business world. And me, I'm just trying to live my life on my own terms, which is all I ever wanted in the first place. Looking back, I don't regret letting Helen do what she did. Maybe that makes me vindictive, maybe it makes me petty, but I think it makes me human. They hurt me, they rejected me for being who I am, and they faced consequences for their actions. I didn't ask for revenge, but when it was offered to me, I took it, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good to watch them realize they'd lost everything because of their own cruelty. I want you to like this video if you think I made the right choice, if you think my family got what they deserved for how they treated me. Subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one because, trust me, I've got plenty more to share. And I want you to drop a comment below telling me your final thoughts on this whole situation. Do you think I should have forgiven them, or do you think Helen did the right thing by holding them accountable? I genuinely want to know what you think, so don't hold back. I'll see you all in the next story, and thanks for listening to mine.